Thank you. I'm delighted to be here. It's a very interesting topic. It's also a very important topic, the future of work. And the Director General's report on the future of work promises an excellent and timely conversation. It raises all the right questions. If it is short on answers, that's because the conversation is just starting. And I want to break into that conversation in paragraph 56 of the report, which starts to consider the impact of technological innovation on work. That's going to be my theme. The report recognizes that new types of innovation, call it robotics, call it automation, may be, and I quote, an inhibitor rather than a generator of decent work. Leave aside what's meant by decent for the moment. But this is precisely the point at which the conversation needs to become far more challenging than it is in the report itself. Because what is being drawn attention to is the massive contradiction between the aim of tackling poverty through job creation and the fact that accelerating automation is destroying jobs at an increasingly fast rate. Since work is the main source of people's income, any net destruction of jobs is, other things being equal, bound to increase poverty and, at the extreme, produce mass starvation. Let me start with two indicators of the worsening position of labour. The first is growing inequality, by which I mean, like Piketty, the decline of the wage share in national income. For most of the last 100 years, the wage share was stable at about 2/3, with a third going to capital. But in the last 15 years, the wage share has dropped to below 60%. I'm talking about Europe and the United States. This is prima facie evidence of a congestive failure of our system to generate enough good jobs to replace jobs being lost. In fact, we have seen a mixture of rising structural employment, to which Raymond Torres has referred, and rising share in total employment of minimum wage, low productivity, part-time jobs. And that doesn't seem to be just cyclical. That seems to be a sort of beginning of a secular trend. The two phenomena, of course, rising inequality and declining or static productivity, go together. How do we explain the worsening of labour's position? Well, analysts try to do so in two ways, which we can call the China hypothesis and the robot hypothesis. China's entry into the global trading system doubled the world's labour force, and simple economics tells us that when the supply of labour goes up, its price goes down. I mean, in a world flooded with cheap Chinese labour, capital becomes scarcer and capital's share of income rises. The effect is familiar from economic history, and eventually this sort of will end as countries catch up, and then the labour capital share should be restored to something like normal. So that's the China hypothesis. It'll take a long time, but eventually the ship will right itself. The robot hypothesis is much more sinister. This holds it wrong to see automation simply as a continuation of past technological progress, which will have the same effects as it had in the past. And this time, it's argued, the effects will be much more serious in at least two ways. In the past, technological innovation enhanced human capital. A worker with a power loom was much more productive than a worker with a hand loom. Today's digital technology has penetrated much deeper into the world of work, and particularly into the world of cognitive work, which was hitherto deemed immune to technology and in fact uniquely human. So you can no longer talk about technology simply as machinery that automates a physical task. It started to automate mental tasks as well, and that is an assault on human uniqueness. A second factor has been the huge increase in computing power. In 1965, Gordon Moore predicted that the amount of integrated computer power would double every 2 years. This was an underestimate. And Martin Ford argues that we are now faced with an incomprehensible increase in our total ability to manipulate information. In short, the substitution of capital for labour can now go much further than in the past. And two academics, Frey and Osborne, have calculated that 47% of existing American jobs will be obsolete within a couple of decades, and similar numbers have been estimated for a number of European countries. Now, two kinds of response can be made to this challenge. The first, optimistic one by Brynjolfsson and McAfee, is that automation will enhance human capital, enabling humans to race with machines. They call it racing with machines rather than racing against them. If we have to race against them, they say we're bound to lose, human beings. And their classic, iconic example is chess. A chess computer can beat a grandmaster, but a grandmaster plus a computer can beat the most advanced chess computers. I mean, if we have to rely just on that example, the future may not be quite as rosy as those two academics believe. On the other hand, Larry Summers argues there's nothing in human history or market logic to suggest that innovation always creates more employment, and he says we're doomed to secular stagnation. Now, these are admittedly Western or advanced country perspectives. They may seem to have little to offer to poor countries who face the overwhelming challenge of poverty. But I'm not so sure. First, there are no frontiers to technology, and automation is proceeding very rapidly in countries like China. Cheap though labour is, robots are still cheaper once the installation costs have been met. And this opens up the following line of thought. In our traditional models of economic history, countries go through 3 stages of development: agriculture, manufacture, and services. With agriculture, though, also being mechanized, developing countries will face a huge problem of absorbing labor into manufacturing. And indeed, if manufacturing is being very rapidly automated, the threat is one of redundant labor. In other words, the Malthusian problem is not something that can be written out of the script, as for many years it was. Now, of course, you can take a more optimistic view, and in a discussion yesterday with Professor Ghosh, pointed out that Japan was the first to automate its industrial processes, and it's had full employment ever since. But 2 points are worth considering. First of all, that Japan's industrialization came much earlier than that of China's or India's. And secondly, that for many years now, Japan has had a static or even declining, static population and an aging population with no net immigration. So, Japan can be regarded perhaps as a special case here. Now, let me return finally to the report. We suffer, I think, from an imaginative failure to envisage a world in which having to work for a living is no longer central to human existence. It's almost impossible to think in these terms. We're so habituated to the opposite. Yet, this was precisely the promise of technology, that it would free up time from drudgery for what used to be called leisure, but which we may now more accurately call activity which affords intrinsic and not just instrumental satisfaction. People making a living out of their hobbies rather than having to go to work in order to get enough to eat. We have examples of such activity in the modern world sprouting out all over the place. But the main lines of public discussion still proceed down the well-worn tracks of a work-oriented future, regaining full employment, decent full employment, of course, enhancing productivity, fitting our labour force to compete in the global market phase, and so a race onwards and onwards and onwards, but with no end point and not much idea of where it's going. The big challenge, it seems to me, will be to develop social, economic and welfare systems which are not exclusively oriented round the world of work, as we have known it since the Industrial Revolution. We need to redefine work and leisure. We need to accept that meaningful activity is not the same as paid activity. We need to decouple both from pay. We need to introduce a basic income paid from robot-enhanced productivity. And in other words, we need a revolution in many of our social economic arrangements and habits. And that, I hope, is what the report will put on the agenda. Thank you.